Well, this is awkward.
Yeah, it is awkward. How was your shower, speaking of awkward?
I'm clean. That's not awkward at all. But why do you only have one earpiece in?
I moved and could only find one after that. Wait, we glossed over the fact that before every Carmudgeon episode, Jason takes a shower for some reason, which is baffling because
My
I guess he
hair
doesn't
is a
want the
disaster.
viewers to smell him.
My hair is a disaster. Hold on, I'm supposed to be recording this on the Zoom thing. We haven't done this in so long that neither one of us can remember like where our headset is. I have gotten even older. He moved. He's in a kitchen without a motorcycle in it.
Yes, this is poverty spec.
The wildest thing is that it's been so long that like I feel like 2020 has been the longest year ever. But it's been so long that my middle finger, which was previously smashed all the way down to the cuticle, is now half grown out. So this is hold on, wait. This is an insight into just how messed up my world is. That I have, what color is this? Shay, S-H-A-Y, is the color of the nail polish that I have to use so that when I'm on camera, people don't notice that my fingernail is black and smashed from an accident I had this summer working on the E30. I don't know, but I give myself manicures now before I go on camera. This is how bad 2020 has gotten.
And that's something you did not historically do?
No.
I mean, these are the questions behind the scenes that people are curious about how many manicures does Jason get before he goes on camera?
Never. I mean, hair and makeup does not include nails. And wait, I have neither hair nor makeup. So this has been a year in which, like I previously, before I would like record a video, I would typically go and get a haircut. You can't do that anymore. It's just not safe. So now I give myself haircuts, and if you watch some of the stuff that's coming up, every term there's one spot on my head that I consistently miss, and I get like a little rascals kind of thing sticking out, and I'm like, oh, everything looks fine in the mirror, and then I realize the camera sees me from different angles than the mirror does. This is a hard year, Derek Tam-Scott.
So sorry.
Where's your motorcycle, and why are you in the wrong kitchen?
I moved, but I left my motorcycle in my old kitchen.
Is that something people do?
No, it's still mine. I'm not there.
Fair enough. I'm not here either. I'm a figment of my own imagination at this point.
And many other people's. We were supposed to, I think, do a Carmudgeon episode. Is that why we're here? Is that what this is? Okay.
Allegedly. Yep.
Do we have a topic?
No, okay, so another behind the scenes thing, usually at about 11 minutes before our scheduled time to get on the Zoom meeting, Derek will send me a text like, what's our topic? And my answer is always the same. What the fuck do you think I am, Jesus? Like, how do I know? There's no topic. So we've thrown around a couple of topics, and this time, unlike other episodes, we haven't made a decision on what we're going to talk about.
But we have narrowed it down to two possibilities. We have been meaning to do a homologation episode for a while. That's a little bit nebulous, because basically everything was homologated for everything at some point. I like the topic because there's a lot of cool homologation special cars that are worth talking about.
I just feel like it is so on brand for the two of us to be like, well, rah, rah, homologation cars, blah, 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 blah. And then you came up with the idea that we should look for homologation cars that sucked. And I thought, that is an amazing episode, but I can't find any. They're all cool.
Yeah, they are all cool. I think in the 14 seconds of preliminary research we did for the homologation topic, I did discover that it was the Peugeot 504 pickup that somehow got homologated for something. And I imagine that's not very good. But I think we should probably do a little more research before we do the homologation topic, which leaves us with our other topic choice for today.
Center of gravity.
Yes, which we have to, I think there's an acknowledgement there to one of your good friends.
Mark Burns.
Yes.
So my friend Mark is, you'll always see him in the credits of every big episode I do of anything, because he is an opinionated Australian
gentleman.
Not the word I was going to use. I think in Australian you're allowed to say this, so I'll say it with no accent, cunt. And but he's very cunty in his cuntiness. He's very nice about it, but he sees through layers of bullshit and is probably actually literally a genius at many things, including zooming out and finding problems with things that we've discussed or episodes that I've done. So Mark is my sort of advisor and my sniff test. He points out all the things I screw up, and he comes up with great ideas. One of the ideas he came up with for us to discuss is where the center of gravity of the automotive universe lies. And by that, the idea is that over the history of the automobile, the most important place geographically has changed. And I think that's a really interesting concept because I think you can argue about where those places are, and I think we should fight about it.
I'm very interested. I started paying attention when you said fight about.
Okay, I was gonna say you're gonna have to repeat that with a little bit more enthusiasm. I'm very interested
in arguing about the location of center of gravity. I think it's very astute to observe that it has shifted over the years, and so I don't know. We can start with the most present time, which is now.
Is that the most present time, or was that a minute ago?
I think by definition,
okay,
it is. Where would you characterize it as being now?
So interestingly enough, I think right now the center of the automotive universe is split between, it's currently Korea and it's moving to the San Francisco Bay Area. Dun, 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 two unexpected answers, right?
Well, the latter I certainly agree with. You look at the difference in reaction between legacy manufacturers and Silicon Valley-based manufacturers in terms of the change to electrification, and there's no question that the emerging center of gravity is for sure the Bay Area, which is weird because historically that is not where the American automotive industry has... this is one of those tough conjugations. I think it's laid. Anyway.
I think that's called HR. So you're getting laid in Detroit. No, kidding. You're right. San Francisco is not a car-friendly city. Let's be honest. The Bay Area is very much sort of pro-biker, pro-Prius, progressive place.
I will say that there is a weird but somewhat obscure history of automotive manufacturing around here. Like Ford used to have a plant in San Jose, NUMMI, which is now Tesla, but used to be originally, I think it was a GM facility, and then it was a joint venture between Toyota and GM for decades, and then it closed, and then Tesla bought it for pennies on the dollar. Mm-hmm. So there is like automotive manufacturing, but it was always sort of like an outpost for how we can make stuff out here so we don't have to ship it from Detroit, rather than being like an engineering center.
Yeah, and what happened was as cars become less about the physical mechanical moving parts and more about the software and underlying technology, there sprouted a bunch of research labs here in the Bay Area. So I think just about every car company has, including all the Germans, have research centers here in Silicon Valley. So this is where they develop some of their infotainment systems. This is where they develop the ADAS, the adapt automatic driving aids, stuff like that. And if you don't think that technology is what's important, look at Tesla's share price, because Tesla is more so than a car company. They are a tech company. And they are currently valued at, I think, more than every other car company in the world ever combined. It's just that's a slight exaggeration, but only slight.
It is certainly the most valuable car company in the world.
Oh yeah, and by an order of magnitude. They're certainly, when you look at the amount of cars that they produce, it shouldn't be this way, but it's their technology lead that's gotten them to that valuation. So I think there's without question, as we move towards electrification and autonomous function, especially, San Francisco Bay Area will become a tech hub and therefore the center of development for the automobile. Immediately prior to this, we have the Korea phenomenon. Right now, interestingly enough, it's Genesis and Hyundai and Kia that are really captivating a younger audience. Like, it's batshit that when I post about a Genesis product on Instagram, people go crazy on it. And this is, something I wouldn't have predicted 25 years ago.
Well, that's because 25 years ago, Korea was making
Hyundai XLs.
Hyundai Excel, that's a great example. I saw one of those recently on my way to collect a Porsche 962, and I saw an Excel, and I pulled over and stop and take a picture of the Hyundai Excel because it still existed. Hopefully I have this photo, we can include it as an insert, but I was just like, I haven't seen one of those in forever, and just, that was the kind of sort of... But I mean, people did the same thing with Japanese cars when Japanese cars first arrived. I mean, you watch have you seen, by the way, the original Subaru is how they pronounce it, the ads from the 1960s?
I have not.
Those are very great. Okay, I'm just giving myself a stack of inserts to do. You have to watch the Subaru 360.
Given a book of celebrating 50 years of Subaru that's about as thick as my house, so I'm going to have to read that and then go watch all these videos.
Is the little Subaru really cheap and ugly? What else can you say about a car that costs $12.97 port of entry?
The little Subaru. Wow.
These are little Subaru parts. This is a carburetor, only $13.50. This is a front fender, only $23.95. This is a brake drum, only $12.67. It doesn't cost much to keep a little Subaru, even if something does go wrong, which isn't very likely.
The little Subaru. Wow.
Yeah, so I mean, when the Japanese, I guess, arrived here for the first time in the 1960s, I think you had a similar reaction to what happened when the Koreans arrived in the 80s, which is like get those little foreign shit boxes, like you could get one for each foot and it would still be less useful than an American motorcycle. Like, that was the mentality. And of course, you see what happened subsequently, which is that the Japanese and then the Koreans sort of took over the market because, as it turns out, there was a better way to do things.
Right. I mean, even when I was a kid, when I was really, a young kid, Japanese cars were considered chintzy. They were all like, oh, look at that chintzy little Toyota or that chintzy little Honda.
That's like that Porsche ad, which I love, from the 90s, it has a picture of a 964 America RS, and it says, look, did you spend your youth dreaming about a Nissan or a Toyota? And it's like, wow, that was very relevant and true, but also rude then. But if you say that now, it just holds no credence, because there's just an entire generation of people who are like, I mean, hell yeah, like, I exactly did that. I dreamt about, a 300ZX and, a Toyota Supra Mark IV. And so that notion, you couldn't even put that in an ad, but 25 years ago, that was a very, like, sort of compelling ad, which is, don't go buy a 300ZX. You didn't spend your youth dreaming about a Nissan product. This is what you dreamt about. So, I mean, that's it. I feel like in many ways the 90s weren't that long ago, I guess because I experienced them firsthand, but then you look at a piece of copy like that and you're like, wow, this is a dramatic shift philosophically, because all of the people now are like, I'm as interested in having an NSX as I am in having a 911, maybe more.
And I'm just off of filming 9 episodes, 9 different shows. So I have all of those scripts bouncing around in my head. But one of them was Spotlight, the old Spotlight, the ISSIMI show, is becoming Revelations. And I did one of the episodes on the new BRZ. And while I was sort of writing this script and coming up with what's really important about this car, I came to the conclusion that we used to have an entire class of cars that were affordable and that were fun, and that were not perfect, but because of their price and their affordability, we were willing to put up with maybe a little bit less quality and a little bit less speed. And that's the sport compact car era, where we had things like, and it was dominated by Japanese, and that's why I bring it up. If you think about when I was growing up in the late 80s, early 90s, we had Honda CRX, Honda Prelude, Acura Integra, forget about Type R, just even the regular Integra. And I came up with this list, like Nissan Sentra SE-R, Nissan NX, Nissan Pulsar. You just start thinking about these nameplate after nameplate after nameplate of cars that are all gone and they're all dead at this point. Almost all Japanese. I mean, you had some like Ford Probes and stuff like that, which was actually an MX-6, so therefore it was technically Japanese. That they're all gone. And you realize that was the center of my automotive universe in the 1980s.
Yeah, but conceptually, that exact same idea existed before that. It was just in a different form factor and from a different place, because that's what the MGB was. The Fiat 124 and the MGB and Triumph TRs and all that stuff were the same thing, which is like imperfect but fun and relatively affordable and uh, definitely imperfect. They just sort of turned the formula backwards by making almost everything front-wheel drive, and the location of that all moved. But that concept has always resonated with motorists. I mean, you go back to the 1950s, 40s, probably pre-war also it was true, right? MGTCs and stuff like that.
Okay, so let's organize our thoughts here. So for the center of universe discussion, I think the automobile starts both in Germany and the U.S., right? I mean, so we have Gottlieb Daimler coming up with inventing the automobile in Germany.
1886.
Did you do
Patent
your homework for this, or
Motorwagen?
you just
No,
know this
you just
stuff?
have to know as a car enthusiast what year the car was invented. 1886.
Patenwagen was sometime in the 1880s. Yeah. And then I think it sort of stayed, it was sort of stratified around the world, right? Everyone was sort of...
Yeah, it
coming
was
up
a
with-
very fragmented, and you look at the number of manufacturers, and I think consolidation really started to occur in the 1920s, because there's all these nameplates that just don't exist, like Didion Bouton and like all this, weird old stuff that just no longer exists. And so there was a lot of consolidation, I think, in the 1920s, because it used to be like that you could be a man in a shed and make a car.
Here we're again. I don't know if you've realized that we're in the 2020s. 100 years later, the history is repeating itself again. I mean, I just
did you
keep
make a
hearing
car in the shed?
Oui, and I called it the Didion Bouton. No, but I mean, all of a sudden, these new car companies are popping up left and right because they are able to do the things that the traditional car companies can't do with being agile in terms of electric powertrains. But to go back there.
But it was happening all over the world,
Right.
yes. I mean, there was certainly activity happening in Europe, not all over the world, but it was certainly happening on both sides of the Atlantic.
Yeah.
Anywhere that was industrialized.
And then I feel like was it really the Model T that really cemented this sort of U.S. for a while there as the center of the automotive universe?
I mean, just because of the mass production and sort of the accessibility for mainstream consumers. I mean, that was the car. I think there's some absurd figure where take some year, call it before 1928, because that's when the Model T was replaced by the Model A. But like the percentage of cars on the road in America, like I think it was 90% of them were Model Ts. I mean, it literally put an entire country on wheels in a way that most other countries eventually did, but later on. I mean, for Fiat, it was the Cinquecento, the original 500. In Germany, obviously it was the Volkswagen. In Britain, I would say later on the Mini, but before that you had the Morris Minor and the Austin 7. So I guess the Austin 7 was probably the second sort of mass market, entire country mobilizing car, but there were sort of these cars that each of them mobilized their respective countries en masse. And there was also like high-end innovative stuff happening in America also. I mean, you had Cadillacs, and you think about the stuff that Miller was doing, and that's the technology that ended up in Duesenberg, but he was an Indy 500 guy, and so the Duesenberg had a dual overhead cam, 4-valve per cylinder engine, like in the late 20s. And so there's like technological innovation in terms of the car itself. Like the Ford Model T is not technically sophisticated, but it was innovative in other ways. So I mean, when was there an American center of gravity for automotive, purposes? It was probably from the early 1900s to into the 20s, probably until probably about the Depression or so. I mean, has the United States ever really led in terms of innovation since then?
Probably in the 1950s, this is a guess, I don't know, but there was not a lot of engineering per se going into the cars, but there was certainly enough style that
and
that
marketing,
all eyes, right?
Yes, and the whole sort of every year there's a new car, and we're figuring out how to slice and dice the market. I mean, because you see this now with the proliferation of SUV coupes or whatever the hell, and coupe sedans and all that garbage. But I mean, that stuff was invented by the Americans. The Americans were like, oh, we should, sort of the Series 62 Cadillac and the Series 60 Cadillac and all these sort of, or you look at the Ford lineup in the early 60s and you're like, here's the Fairlane 300 and the 500 and the Galaxy and the Thunderbird and all this stuff. The Falcon was a big deal when it came out because it was like small or whatever, which, by any other standards it's not. The Mustang was a huge deal for the same reason. So the Americans in the 50s and 60s were really figuring out how to identify like consumer preferences and how to market to specific individuals, because before that there was like this kind of airplane mentality. I think the way that airplanes are made is engineers design something and then they're like, okay, here it is, like everybody come buy one, and that doesn't work. And car makers, I think, were kind of doing that for a while, and then at some point they're like, okay, we have to figure out what consumers are after. And so you get these sort of post-war wealth in America and baby boomers who are like, I want something to do this exact thing. Or if anybody saw Ford versus Ferrari, that's what Lee Iacocca was doing with the Mustang, which is there's all these young people who don't want this sort of like stodgy stuff. So I agree. In the 50s and 60s, America was sort of innovating, but perhaps not technically, because you look at the stuff and you're like, oh, this all has leaf springs and, push rods. So that's not where they were innovating, but they were innovating in other ways.
I think what you're saying is what I've been saying for years, is that America does one thing better than any other country, and it's marketing. Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, we turned the car into sex, we gave it sex appeal, and we made people desire to have something far greater than just transportation. Mm-hmm. And so I think we nailed that. But
as an expression of self, the car as an expression of your identity, of who you are. Your car is who you is an extension of yourself.
Mm-hmm. So where do the Brits fit into this? Because, I mean, you sort of have to. There had to have been a point in the history of the world where the British car industry, which was massive, was the center of gravity. I mean, it's got to be the sort of MGB, sort of early I guess it's not early Jaguars. That's sort of late Jaguar. Did they just never have their moment?
I think the British contributed an absolute metric shitload, to use the official term.
But aren't they imperial?
They use the English system, I guess, yeah.
Which is not a metric
system. An English shitload.
There you go. Shedload.
A shedload. We'll have to measure that in stone. So like the 1950s, I think they were doing some really extraordinary stuff. I mean, the sort of, I think we have them to thank for the sports car, in the sort of mass production kind of way, MGs.
It's so funny. It's so funny that a country like England, where it rains 340
that's
something
why
days
they
a
do
year.
it.
Yeah.
Because you have to extract maximum driving value in minimum amount of driving days. So you're going to have an experience when you do.
I always found that so interesting that Germany's take rate, for example, for convertibles is enormous. I mean, Germany buys more convertibles than we do, and their weather is mostly miserable.
It's like solar, right? They have a shitload of solar, and then it's never sunny.
And it's never sunny. But I guess that's where you would think if you lived in dreary old England all the time, your whole life too, you would want to really take in every single ray of sunshine when it finally happens.
Whereas in Southern California, like, it's sunny, I don't want a convertible.
Get me out of the sun because I'm getting skin cancer. Yeah.
Yeah, because I spend all of my involuntary time out in the sun anyway. Britain in the 1950s, I would posit. I mean, you think about the number of times Jaguar won Le Mans in the 1950s, and you think also about the XK120. I know I've harped on this before, but the significance of the Jaguar XK120 is really hard to overstate, because everybody at the end of the war was like, I need a car, anything. Like, just give me something to buy and I will buy it because I need a car. And so everybody's rushing their pre-war stuff into production, and Jaguar comes out in 1948 with this all-new sports car with a twin-cam engine. And everyone is like, holy shit, that's crazy. And the reason why Jaguar did that, honestly, was because they wanted to showcase the new engine. And it was supposed to go in all their sedans, which it eventually did, but the sedan wasn't ready. So they were like, we'll make a new sports car concept for it just to showcase the engine. And then everybody freaked out about it. And so then they were like, oh geez, we have to actually make these in large numbers. And so we can't make, the initial ones were aluminum and handmade. And then they were like, we have to mass produce these. So the later ones are after the first few hundred cars, they switched to steel. And there's like the aluminum ones are worth twice as much. Anyway, so very sophisticated like car early post-war period. And then Jaguar started racing them and sort of killed everybody at Le Mans several times. I think they won 5 times in the 1950s. And then they introduce disc brakes, and then they do semi-monocoque construction, and then like cars are very aerodynamic also, and then the independent rear suspension which appears in the E-Type. I mean, that was the, I think, peak. Of course, all of this is mostly Jaguar. innovating. You get some Lotus stuff also in terms of actually pushing the envelope of the technology.
You talk also about Mini, right? Mini was not
That's
that
true.
far
Yes.
on, right? I mean, that was pioneering transverse engine, front wheel drive.
Yep. Which created a model which everybody still uses today. I mean, done by an Italian guy, to be fair, Isigonis, but
it went into a British car, yeah.
It did go into a British
because
car.
the Italians probably just couldn't get their shit together. They're too busy.
I mean, they did the same thing, but backwards, right? The Fiat 500 is rear-wheel drive with the engine in the back, and the Mini is front-wheel drive with the engine in the front.
Right. Yeah. So there was clearly a period where England was the center of gravity of the car world. My question goes to So we're obviously going to wind up with Germany, right? There was probably large portions of the history of the automobile were Germany, but were France and Italy ever really the center of gravity? That's an interesting discussion.
Center of gravity?
I mean, you could say that Italy.
Let's start with. I think France is easier to reach an answer for.
Because the answer is no.
Yes, because the answer is no.
Although, look, France had the Duchauveau moment.
And the DS.
And the DS. Okay. I mean, that's not...
It's not the center of gravity, but
it was the standard of the world. I mean,
it was the standard of the world, and it pushed the state of conventional automobiling. I mean, first production car with disc brakes, and it's not some exotic sports car. It's like a family sedan.
A very
big
wealthy
family sedan.
Yeah.
Big family sedan. But I mean, but was it anybody other than Citroen who did that? I mean.
Who did disc brakes, or who really?
No. Who in the French industry? Oh, you go to the pre-war era in France. Like you think about Bugatti, you think about the expense at the top end of the market. Bugatti and Delahaye and Delage, and they're pushing the limits for sure, especially aesthetically. I mean, you look at some of the streamlined like Figoni Falaschi stuff that came out of there, and Sauchik, and in motorsports Bugatti for sure. I mean, it was sort of. Bugatti, Alfa Romeo, Bentley was kind of the trifecta. Mercedes-Benz later on in the 30s. SSK. So yeah, Mercedes-Benz, Bugatti, Bentley, and Alfa Romeo were the sort of premier sports car manufacturers and motorsports participants in the interwar years. All of them. I mean, Bentley stopped in 1930 because they went out of 31 because they went out of business.
For the first of many times.
Yeah, that is true.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, as we're talking about this, I'm thinking like looking at a map. It's all Europe, right? I mean, it's Europe, U.S., sort of passed back and forth.
Well, we're still, I think, relatively early post-war right now. I mean, so peak France is probably before the war. Honestly, in terms of like global impact in motorsports and otherwise, I forgot to mention Tablago also. So yeah, peak France. If you could make an argument for the center of the automotive universe being in France, it would be in the 1930s, I think. Italy.
Italy's a tough one because even though Italy was always at the center of everyone's attention. I mean, starting, with obviously Ferrari and then Lamborghini and Alfa Romeo and all their racing successes.
Yeah, Alfa Romeo before the war.
Yeah. But was it ever the center of the universe in terms of like, no one, like the Fiat, whatever the fuck it, 124 was, or, none of the Fiats were ever the...
But wasn't there a time when Fiat was like the biggest car company in the world or something like that? I think there has to have been.
It wouldn't surprise me. I mean, they did really make a lot of cars. I just didn't know, were they ever the
500. I mean, it was all because of the 500. But, look, we've talked about there are other cars who kind of served the same function. I believe Fiat was the biggest car company in the world for a non-trivial amount of time. So, I don't know. What do we take away from that? Their impact in the United States has always been a little bit attenuated by they just haven't had that much market penetration here.
It's always been exotic.
Ever?
I mean, there's never been... Has there ever been sort of a run-of-the-mill Italian car sold here? I mean,
yeah.
We think of Italians, we think immediately Ferrari, Lamborghini, Alfa Romeo, Maserati, but we never think Fiat. I mean,
we don't, I guess. But if you go, you go to Europe and they're everywhere.
Well, in the same way that you go to Germany and BMW is just a car. It's not a luxury car. It's nothing special. It's just a car. There's Volkswagen, Mercedes, BMW. For us, those are sort of far more premium than they are to the traditional German customer. Same thing with Italy. We're like, oh, something is Italian, it must be amazing. Not necessarily.
I think we're underselling the impact globally of Fiat. They really did produce just a lot of cars. Technically, that usually prevents you from being super innovative, I think. But
I feel like, Toyota is the largest car company of
no, you're right. You're
the
right.
majority
You're
of the
right.
press.
Okay, I take that back. Because the Toyota production system completely changed things.
And let's I hate to bring it up, but let's not talk about Prius. I mean, that's really the first mass market, large scale production of hybrids.
Yeah.
Kind of changed the world. So yeah, I just think Italians have always been at the center of sex appeal for the rest of the world, even when they've made a large amount of cars, but not really for manufacturing.
But I mean, we haven't really defined how we're talking about making impact anyway. But certainly in terms of innovation and motorsports, the Italy is impossible to ignore. I mean, you start in the pre-war years with Alfa Romeo. The 8C won Le Mans 4 times. The Alfa Romeo won the Mille Miglia 10 out of 11 times between 1928 and 1938. That's just before the war, and then after the war, obviously, like Ferrari's dominance in endurance car racing, and I mean, Alfa won F1 F1 championships after the war. Ferrari, I mean, obviously at Le Mans, and when Ford appeared, and that's why that was such a big deal in the first half of the 60s. And in terms of introducing like technical innovations, I think they were up there generally as well.
But it definitely stopped. I mean, they're another one that they sort of peaked. Italy technically peaked early. If you if you think about it that way, like when was the last time Ferrari won a Le Mans? 1950, whatever.
Well, they stopped racing 65.
But those last few years, this is not my milieu, but the last few years were not kind to Ferrari. I don't think they were doing.
No, I mean, the 917 just dominated them into the 70s, and then when they went to 3-liter cars starting in 72, the 312 never succeeded, I think, in the way that they hoped it would. But F1, I mean, they were dominating into the 2000s and then kind of stopped. That's where they transitioned all their effort. Eventually, they were like, okay, we're going to focus on Formula One, which they did quite effectively, obviously, through the Schumacher years.
So I think it's kind of safe to say, starting in the 60s, everything started to slowly move. I was going to say move to Germany, but here's the thing. When we get into the 60s and 70s, was there any... I mean, I feel like I can drive a 1960s Mercedes and a late 1970s Mercedes, and I'm not seeing much of a difference.
I think they were kind of the finest cars in the world at the time, though.
What, German stuff or those cars?
The Mercedes-Benzes, in terms of just quality of the cars. I mean, Mercedes just made an absolute continuous stream of innovations also during this period. I mean, you look at their experimental safety cars and the C111 and setting diesel speed records and endurance records, introducing ABS and airbags.
That was later, though. I feel
this
like
is like 70s. This is in the 70s.
I feel like the 60s were not really a great time for automotive development. Like, if you... I have limited experience here, but I feel like you drive most late 50s cars and most late 60s cars are not all that
Oh, there's a big difference. Huge difference, in my opinion.
Why,
the difference between... Yes.
Well, okay, so it took 10 years to develop?
Well, no, and road holding. There's a big road holding difference. The difference between driving a 50s Jaguar and a 60s Jaguar is huge because of road holding. Same thing with Ferraris. When you transition to independent suspension and unitary construction... and like disc brakes, the difference is a car that cannot be used in modern traffic and a car that can. A 50s car, you feel really uncomfortable and out of place driving in modern traffic, and a 60s car, like a performance car, you don't. Like an E-Type, a late 60s Ferrari, like a late 60s Lamborghini, it's the difference between, like, I can do this on the highway and, like... So to me, I feel like there's a really stark difference that comes with 5-speed gearboxes, disc brakes, independent suspension, and unitary construction, and all of those things sort of arrive around that same time between the 50s, like between 1955 and 1967. and you get like a really stark improvement in usability. Even though they all kind of like look old and vintage and smell carbureted, there's a big usability difference. And that's why the 300 SL is so noteworthy, is because the 300 SL is a car from the 50s that you can use today in a way that most 50s cars you can't.
Oh, here's an episode. Cars that were more than 10 years ahead of their time.
I love that topic.
That's
I'm very interested.
Right. Hello to the
BMW 328.
Right. It was the first one that came to my mind.
And for me, 300 SL.
What is this weird reflection here going
You
on?
have something coming through your window.
I'm going to go this way. Now it's down here. Very strange. Anyway, fair enough. I think maybe my experience with late 50s to early 60s cars is all American, and I feel like they did not.
Oh, yes. I agree with American cars. Not a whole lot happened. And a lot of the stuff, I love that period of car also because a lot of that influence is motorsports driven. It's all this stuff where it's like, oh, it was pioneered by the people who won Le Mans in the 50s, and then you look at cars in the 60s and you're like, all this stuff is here. That's why the E-Type is so significant, because it's basically like, oh, we learned all this shit winning Le Mans 5 times. Here it is in a car that everybody can buy, and we'll sell 70,000 of them, and they'll be 2,000 pounds sterling. Enjoy.
Yeah.
Like, that's so cool. And so I guess I'm obviously fond of that period. And there's always these interesting moments where certain manufacturers innovate, even though there's not like a cost correlation to it, because an E-Type costs, I don't know, half as much as an Aston DB, and it's much more technically sophisticated. Same thing for Ferrari. I mean, there was no other car in 1961 that you could buy with unitary construction, independent rear suspension, and a twin cam motor and disc brakes besides an E-Type. Nobody offered that at that same time. And the same thing was true like with the Alfa Giulia, which was like a relatively small, 4-cylinder, under 2-liter car, but it had, a twin cam motor, 5-speed gearbox, and disc brakes, which you couldn't get in a Ferrari, you couldn't get it in a Mercedes, you couldn't get it in a Jaguar, you couldn't get it in a Porsche. It was for like a brief shining moment, a 1600cc 4-cylinder car was the most technically sophisticated car you could buy. And so it's interesting where you see these like moments where all these technical innovations happen to occur in some manufacturer that's not selling the hottest, most expensive car around during that period. Did I go down a rabbit hole?
No.
Never mind. Don't answer that question.
Right. Just don't ask a question you don't want the answer to. But you have, obviously Alfa Romeo was, that is exactly why Alfa Romeo cemented itself as the premier manufacturer of sports sedans, right? First of all, it was premier in that it was first.
Yes. Yeah, the Giulia for sure, and the Giulia GT, which is the GTV looking thing, the early thing, and I mean the same thing. The Alfa did the same thing in the 50s. Alfa and BMW both did this thing, which was they were making exotic high performance cars in early post-war Europe when nobody had any money or fuel, and they both had to pivot. And BMW's way to pivot was to make the Isetta, which was a 300cc single cylinder barely a car. And Alfa's solution was like, we're going to take all of this innovative stuff that we've been doing in race cars, and we're going to put it into a smaller, more affordable car and sell it at to large numbers of people. And so the Giulietta was really significant because A, it saved the company, and B, it was like, look at all this cool shit you can get in like an approachable car, whereas a British sports car is like a cross between a tractor and a motorcycle. In terms of like aesthetics and technical content.
And in terms of keeping the weather out, it's a cross between an umbrella and nothing.
And a motorcycle. It's a hybrid between a motorcycle and an umbrella. And a bathing suit.
Yep. And then I kind of feel like it was just smooth sailing from here on out. I mean, it just became Germany. I feel like from 1970 throughout the misery of the Malaise era, I mean, I say this. I think I've said this before on this podcast. But if you think 2020 was a bad year, go back and read car magazines from 1982. I mean, it may be a bad year.
I mean, 1975 also.
Holy shit! Well, I mean, pre-75 even they were scared to death.
Yeah.
Of like all this was coming and like all these emissions regulations and fuel economy standards. It's going to be the end of the car. It's going to be the end of the convertible. Right?
Yes.
They all really thought they would.
And that's why T-tops and Targas were a thing that sort of persisted for decades until people were like, oh wait, never mind.
Oh wait, didn't happen. Yeah, all of that was because the car industry thought the U.S. government was going to outlaw convertibles because of rollover tests. So the 911 Targa was actually invented out of that fear. Like, this is something that will pass U.S. rollover standards, and those wound up never materializing. And it's kind of important to look back and realize that there was a long period of time during which there were no convertibles. So if you look in the late 1970s, early 1980s, there were barely any convertibles for this fear, because this fear persisted for a while. So Porsche came out with the Targa in 74? I don't remember what year that was.
67.
67. And then there were basically no convertibles. You had the
Yeah, and the
Mercedes 107.
convertible 911, the actual convertible 911 did not come out until 1983, which is 19 years after the 911 was introduced. The first 19 years of the 911's life, there was no convertible version.
Think about, the Mercedes R107 SL came out in 1971. So think about what your choices were if you wanted a convertible from 1971 through 1989, which was the end of that 107. Your choices were a 911 Targa.
Later, the Cabriolet, starting in 83. I mean, you get an MGB.
Right. At the beginning, you can get an MGB.
Until 1980, yeah.
And that's
Volkswagen Beetle.
Beetle
until
convertible.
1980.
Right. Bitch basket, Volkswagen. That's it. Slim pickings. So I remember reading stories like when the Fox Body Mustang convertible came out and the LeBaron convertible came out in the 80s. Everyone lost their minds because there had been almost 20 years during which you basically couldn't get a convertible. I mean, there were Corniche 2, Rolls Royces. There were all this other weird, obscure stuff. But it was very, very difficult to get a convertible. So the fact that right now...
and that's why everybody went wild for convertibles, I guess, in the 90s, when you get stuff like Sunfires, and then you get like the Solar.
There was some cool stuff.
And the Sebring.
Which that would just replace the LeBaron. But I remember when we were kids, my sister wanted a LeBaron convertible more than anything else. And it was just mostly because convertibles didn't exist. They really didn't exist. Your choice was some crotchety old leaky British thing from the 60s or nothing. And then all of a sudden there was
a Mercedes SL for all of the monies.
Right, which was just not even, you think Mercedes SLs are expensive now and rare now. They're just no contest compared to back then. They were serious money.
Yeah.
I kind of feel like throughout the Malaise era, there was kind of the center of gravity was just hell.
I think it has to be Germany during that period, and I think the reason why is because you have all of these you have these regulatory restrictions. And so, of course, it's the Germans who figure out some clever way to sort of overcome all of that, because it's a technical problem that was presented to them. And so when the problem is technical in nature, of course, the Germans excel.
Well, and as always, I feel like the Americans innovate. The Americans innovate. The Germans, we come up with the greatest ideas, and it's marketing stuff. Twilight Sentinel, which is, an automatic headlight system. And then the Germans kind of figure out how to make it actually work, and then the Japanese perfect it. And I think that whole, the whole emissions and malaise era really highlights that.
Well, yeah, that's when the Japanese really start to make inroads into the United States market, is because of the two fuel crises in 73 and 79. And we've talked already about CVCC, but that was kind of this sort of technical cleverness and representative of Soichiro Honda's sort of general innovative mindset. There's a reason why that came out of Honda and not Toyota. Right. I think Toyota's innovation was more in terms of production rather than technical content of their cars. And so then the Japanese start to make inroads because the priorities and preferences of the market are shifting in a way that American manufacturers couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge.
Yeah, I think we're going to see this right now. I just saw some statistic that the increase in number of people who would be willing to consider the purchase of electric car is up 50% in the last year or something. And I think we as a society are always very slow to adapt to change, and we're like, no, in the 70s people are like, get rid of that cheap chintzy Japanese shit, we don't need it. And then you sting them in the pocketbook, and you make it so that your 3 mile per gallon sedan is something you can't keep on the road anymore. And all of a sudden, the different way becomes appealing. And that was when the Japanese stuff started to become appealing. But I think you can blame, or you can you can thank Mercedes for being at the center of the technological revolution that solved the fuel crisis shit and the safety shit. It's all Mercedes, right? I mean, if you the 201, I go back to this car all the time. Yes, I know, blah blah blah. But the 201 Mercedes was the one that really figured it all out. So we can have a subcompact luxury sedan with a 4-cylinder in it that costs a mint, but actually advanced the engineering and basically completed the engineering of the automobile. We haven't had too many innovations since that car. You think 1982, it had airbags, it had ABS brakes, it had crumple zones, it had a coefficient of drag of 0.32, it had the wedge shape that we still have in every sedan today. It had a 5-link rear suspension with a modified strut front. The only area...
Does it have electronic fuel injection?
It had K-Jet, but yeah, it's technically Bosch continuous fuel injection. That was the one area. So Mercedes was very strange. Mercedes was very late to adopt... God, this weird stripe across my face is very strange.
I think you have Venetian blinds. Do you have Venetian blinds, Jason?
I have Venetian blinds, and it's obvious. Can't get away from this. I'm just going to leave like this right here. There's got to be some way to... There we go. Mercedes was very reluctant to adapt to computers. I mean, I have a brochure for the 2316 that has a whole page in it that's dedicated to, we know you don't trust these computers and we don't trust them either, so this is a fully mechanical system with electronic fine-tuning, and should the computers break, your car will still run. I mean, they were very conservative, where BMW and Audi for sure were really pushing for
yeah, I mean, they went full Medtronic around that time. Porsche went full Medtronic in 84. I mean, and Mercedes did it, I guess, a decade, 92.
10 years later. I mean, up through 92, 93, you could still buy Mercedes with CIS fuel injection, which
92 in the V8. And the 6-cylinder, I think it was 93 in the SL. You could still get mechanical fuel injection.
Somewhere around there. Yeah. I mean, that's just the US market. My guess is that you could probably get, K-Jet even later in European markets. At this, in the U.S., it was a matter of emissions, right? We had tightening emissions regulations, and there's just only so much you can do with a 40-year-old fuel injection system. But really, Mercedes took the lead and developed everything. BMW had obviously the E30, which pushed along the idea of a sports sedan, and they pushed along the idea of sedans that could outperform sports cars.
But not a lot of technical content that was innovative.
I mean, they were pretty late. If you think about, they were pretty late to multi-valve engines. They were pretty late to a lot of different technology. It was really Audi and Volkswagen. Volkswagen was really ahead of the charts, led by Audi. I have to admit. I mean, Audi was really a tech company.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and of course, this keeps coming up. Ferdinand Piëch, right? I mean, Quattro system and the Audi 200. As much as people sort of make, are you reading it, or do you still just own it?
I still just own it. I used it as a prop in an episode I filmed last week, but I have yet
progress.
to. I read the first page, but yeah, it's for Piëch's autobiography, which I can't wait to read.
Just the content of the Audi 200, which now you never see them anymore because other reasons have hobbled those cars and caused them to return to the earth, and so you just never see them anymore. But the 200 was a really innovative car, and I think it is a product of Piëch's sort of thinking and sort of pushing the envelope in much the same way that Mercedes was.
In German, Audi's tagline is
Vorsprung durch Technik.
Yeah, Technik.
Technik.
Get a little
Technik.
Technik. Yeah, Technik. And that's progress through technology. Right? I mean, that's their.
Even in English language, in the UK, they were using that tagline. I think until like in the 2000s. In German, they would use the tagline.
Very bad British. Vorsprung durch Technik. What's Audi's tagline in the US? What was it? Did they have one?
I'm sure they do. I have a huge stack of 1990s Audi brochures, actually.
I have a huge stack of magazines. Unfortunately, my laptop is on the stack of magazines right now, so I can't grab them.
Oh, my laptop's on a pot.
You're doing the pot trick again? That's why you look so young.
Pot.
If I do this, will I look? Oh, look. I can do the selfie angle. Then you can see all the shit on the floor from the last shoot I was on. I am going to close this blind because this is driving me nuts. Hold, please. Talk amongst yourselves.
You were doing that the entire time with your blinds open?
What?
You were doing that the entire time with the blinds open?
No, they were closed, but they weren't closed enough, apparently. And now I'm like blinded by the sun and whatever. Sorry for everyone who's on the East Coast right now. They're getting a foot of snow. Do you believe we're like a week away from Christmas? We're 10 days as we record this. Today's the 15th, but I don't know when this video is going live. This is absurd. This is not acceptable to me.
Which?
That is, Christmas is here.
Oh.
I haven't even thought about it yet. I don't have Christmas
like
lights
2020.
Yeah.
It'll be a good one.
Ugh, this year. Right. Okay, so clearly after Germany...
So yeah, Germany was the center of the universe. Call it in what? So the mid-70s to
all the way through...
into the 90s?
Early 90s.
But we have also discussed how at the same time Japan is making meaningful inroads, especially in the United States market, which is,
The 80s, I think, was what really set the stage for the Japanese car companies. I think is where everyone realized there's a better way. Like, your car doesn't have to break.
And it doesn't have to be this inefficient, and it doesn't have to be this coarse. I mean, you look at the stuff from the Malaise era, American stuff, and you're just like, I cannot believe consumers were like, oh yeah, that's fine with me.
They didn't know any better.
No, they didn't. I get it.
It's really interesting. I was in college. When I worked in college, I worked for Chrysler. And so we did these displays at malls and concerts and county fairs and special events and stuff. And this was like Chrysler's 1990s design-led, like, amazing era when
oh, yes.
Everything they made was beautiful. So starting from the neon to the cloud cars, which was the Plymouth Breeze, the Chrysler Cirrus and Dodge Stratus. The minivans were beautiful. Stratus. The minivans were beautiful.
And let's not forget the cab forward, the LH and the
LH cars.
Intrepid.
Dude, when we parked a 300M in the mall, people just flocked to it like it was unbelievable, like it was ice cream. It was unbelievable.
A 300M. So this is like 97.
This was 97. So I worked for them from 96 to 98. But so, I mean, this was like prime Chrysler's, 1990s design led everything. And I would have people come over to me all the time and be like, I love my Voyager. I have 300,000 miles on it. It's given me no trouble. And I'd be like, I should say I was not paid on commission. I'd be like, really? You have 300,000 miles on your Chrysler minivan with no problems. How many transmissions have you been through? And they're like, 6. Like, okay. And then, did you have any problems with the rear latch? Oh yeah, the hatch would fly open occasionally. That's been 3 recalls. And I'm like, and what? And I would just go through, I'm like, how about oil consumption? Oh yeah, I had to have it re-ringed. And you go through the list, and there were just a couple of big problem areas that all those cars had. And people would love their car in spite. And this was in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and sort of. And
I mean, this is what people do with Italian cars all the time.
Well, they didn't know. These people genuinely didn't know that you could put 100,000 miles on a car and never have to bring it into the dealership. So they loved the car inherently, and that's because it was a good-looking thing and whatever, blah, 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 blah. It
was functional.
Right, but they didn't realize there was another way. And the 80s were really the time, I think, where most of America came of age and realized, like, wow, the cars, like, I had friends whose parents' Ford LTDs rotted into the ground in 3 years. Literally were no longer roadworthy, and they would still have 2 years left to pay on it, or a year to pay on it, and it was totaled. It wouldn't pass inspection. And
wow.
Worthless, right. And this is the shit that we dealt with American cars in the 1970s and early 1980s, which is why my whole generation hates American cars. Either that or you're like Mike Musto and you're only like, muscle cars because you're a glutton for punishment. But these cars were genuinely wretched, and people would get burned by their Ford and burned by their GM.
How do you think about the GM Diesel debacle?
Think about this. I mean, these average engines lasted on average 10,000 miles and then exploded. And then all of a sudden, here's your neighbor who pulls up in his stupid little Civic. Hi, what are you doing? The car never breaks, never needs oil, never rusts. I mean, they all rusted behind the rear fenders, but you know what I mean? Like, all of a sudden, this became a viable piece of transportation that was worth more for longer, cost less to operate, cost less to repair. And everyone just switched. And by the time you got to 1990, man, that 90 Accord, the Civic,
and the whole
that was going on, the
Camry best-selling car for 900 years in a row.
And it was very simple. The Japanese figured out for the U.S. market, you don't try to impose Japanese size requirements onto the U.S. market. So 92 Camry comes out.
And this, again, was Honda right, who in 1984 opens the Marysville plant in Ohio, and they're like, oh, we should make a separate plant that makes a separate car that's optimized for the American market, because if we sell the stuff that we think is right, like, it just doesn't function, because it's like trying to speak a different language.
Which is what happened to Volkswagen when they opened the Westmoreland plant earlier than that. So VW was the first foreign manufacturer to open a plant. They opened it outside of Pittsburgh. I live right by there, in Westmoreland County. And what they did was they produced Rabbits, Mark I Golfs, with the world's shittiest interiors, and they just basically put fluffy, nasty velvet interiors in these cars, and we're like, now they'll sell for Americans. Meanwhile, Americans like, we don't want subcab hatches, you morons. And so they took all the inherent goodness out of the car and took only the bad shit and hawked it on U.S. consumers. They were hideously unreliable. They were terribly built, and guess what? Didn't work. Honda figured it out. Like, let's ask the people who live in Marysville, Ohio, what they want, and let them engineer the cars. Toyota did the same thing with their Georgetown, Kentucky plant. That
Just
was 92
later,
Camry.
of course, because they follow Honda.
Yeah. But I mean, I consider the 92 Camry to be the most important Japanese car for the American market. The 92 Camry was when Camry went from being a subcompact sedan to what was called a midsize, but really was a full-size sedan. Designed in the U.S., built in the U.S., engineered in the U.S., specifically for the U.S. market. And all of a sudden they were selling 400,000 a year of them overnight, out of nowhere. Reliable, everything that American consumers wanted. And from that point on, Toyota was on top of the world in this country. And they still have not fallen. I mean, you got to think, if you have a non-car person ask you what to get, I just need something that I don't have to think about, that will do what I ask it to, will never do what I don't want it to do, will never break, and just no frills, no bullshit, just A to B transportation. It's Toyota every time. Or Mazda. I mean, I personally recommend Mazdas.
That's because you're an enthusiast.
Well, but if somebody wants something different, right? I don't want a RAV4. I can't look at it. It's Mazda Cx-5 without question. You can get a turbo on it. It's stunningly beautiful. I mean, you have on the SUV scale of beauty, you have Alfa Romeo Stelvio and Mazda CX-5 kind of right at the top. And so to this day, in terms of just reliable, basic transportation, Japan wins. Until you get to Tesla.
Well, and I think also we should talk about the Korean invasion. I actually don't know that much about the Korean invasion. I feel like they're sort of doing what Japan did, but like a little edgier or something.
So,
I mean, how do you characterize the difference between what Japan did in the 90s and what Korea did in the 2000s?
So the way I see it is that Lexus is the one that really made the mark for the Japanese car companies to really legitimize what they did. And they did that with the Lexus LS400, the original one. And that was basically a carbon copy of the Mercedes S-Class. In that, it took all of the things that were important to regular consumers about the S-Class and threw out all of the unbelievably expensive R&D that was required to stay on top. So they basically rode on Mercedes' coattails engineering-wise and made a better S-Class. Now, you take a Lexus LS400.
Oh, and sold it for $20,000 less.
Oh yeah, half the price. I mean, almost half the price. It started out as $40,000 when the S-Class was $80s. But you were getting something else for the Mercedes money, right? On an Autobahn, maybe the S-Class was, a far superior vehicle. Take them on a twisty back road, and the Mercedes was a better handler, right? But for the vast majority of consumers, the Lexus was an even better car, an even better luxury car than the Mercedes was at half the cost. And I feel like the Koreans have done that again. Hyundai Kia did that again with the original Genesis. They just sort of took a Lexus LS and sort of did the first derivative of that. So we have second derivative of S-Class, which is, we don't need technology, we don't really need innovation. Let's just take tried and true and put it in a car. And go around a corner in an early Genesis, and you know exactly where they saved the money, right? They did not handle well. The structure was pretty weak on those cars, and they just kind of fell apart when you started pushing them. But for most people, that was
like enough. The physical car fell apart, or dynamically it
fell apart. I mean, I'm sure the physical car fell apart eventually, but it didn't on the test drives anyway.
So what would you characterize as the sort of most impactful Korean cars that sort of set the stage? I mean, is it like Sonata and they're just chipping away at mid-size sedan, or like what are the?
It's current Hyundai. So what they did was they hired Albert Biermann away from BMW. And Biermann was the guy who made the golden era of BMWs, i.e. E46, E38, E39. He made them drive the way they drove, which is why those cars rose to the heights, right?
We were just thinking about driving those cars, and I'm just like, ugh.
I know. Like go drive an E30. Like I know if anyone listening hasn't driven one of those cars recently, just go find the shittiest 330i ZHP, the performance pack, and go drive that car. It will blow your mind. Go drive a standard 740i short wheelbase sport package.
Yes.
The car is magic. I mean,
Yeah.
Ferrari wishes it could build something that's that well tuned this day, right? So
Yeah, it just has this wonderful harmony to it. It's
Everything's
so damn good.
And I made it
Till the
6
valley pan
feet.
gasket fails.
It's German. What do you expect? Check engine lights flashing, valley pan.
Or the
I mean,
transmission or the cooling system.
yeah. I made it 6 feet recently in a Kia Forte, and I immediately knew Biermann did that car. And I didn't know that he had anything to do with it, but I know driving the car he did, because it has that feel. It just feels like a 90s BMW, like late 90s BMW. And so Hyundai got him and gave him enough latitude, clearly, or him or his team or a bunch of people, whatever it is internally, gave these guys enough latitude, guys and girls, to make these cars drive well. And that was the silver bullet sort of for the Germans leading the car industry, because now almost every Hyundai and Kia product drives better than the BMW or the Mercedes, or the Mercedes is pretty good at the moment, but certainly the BMW stuff. They're magic to drive. A Hyundai Veloster N is a shitbox. A Volkswagen Golf is not a shitbox. Volkswagen Golf is the best $50,000 car you can buy. But in terms of fun and dynamics, Veloster N destroys Mark 7 GTI. And this is coming from Jason Fanboy for VWs.com, but there's just no contest. And that was the last thing that the Korean car companies needed to really be taken seriously. So
Dynamics.
yeah, Kia Stinger, and all of the current, like all the GV80 or whatever, the big thing with the enormous grille that looks like a Bentley Bottega, because they got the guy who designed the Bentley Bottega to do it. I mean, they're just now full force. Let's get the best people in the industry who know how to tune a chassis. Let's get the best designers in the business to make stuff look expensive without looking chintzy and blingy. Man, they are just killing it. But we have the fork, right? So we have the fork is Korea is killing it in the traditional car company sense, while Tesla and hopefully Rivian and hopefully Lucid will be killing it in the next level car 2.0 autonomous world. So I think right now the center of gravity is a little bit closer towards Korea, but it's being snapped right back to the Bay Area.
I mean, they're doing different things. One is just like raw technical, German style, solve problems with technology. Future, we're designing the future right now. And so, I mean, I think the center of gravity is maybe not here now, but we are at the dawn of a new decade, as it turns out. So for this decade, this shift, by the time we reach the end of the decade, it's going to be very clear in retrospect that.
It is already. I think I have to disagree with you, because if Tesla's value is multiples of what Hyundai Kia's is, I think the world is already recognizing that this shift is happening.
Intrinsically, stock prices are expectations of future returns, so people are betting on Tesla.
Yeah. And I'm betting that the next phase of the automobile is a self-driving electric
transportation pod.
Thing. Yeah. And that the center of gravity will be the Bay Area, which is good because we're here.
Yeah.
I mean, who leaves the house anymore? You switched houses. At least that's a change.
I mean, what a delightful future to be a part of.
It is.
This is why we all drive old cars.
I drive new cars too. Look, I just did a whole bunch.
You have to.
No, I just drove 1,000 horsepower Supra. So one of our next episodes should be things we're doing on the other side, because I want to hear more about your BTS with DTS series. I want to know what you're doing. For you guys, I actually haven't talked to Derek in weeks. and it's because I've been filming. My goal was, and I'm kind of an idiot, my goal was to have a complete season of shows shot before the first one even debuts. And so at Haggerty, on Haggerty's YouTube channel, starting January 4th, whatever that Monday is, every day we have a piece of content debuting. And Thursdays are going to be Jason days. So starting Thursday, January 7th, every Thursday I have a piece of content due. And I have 9 of the 10. So the year is divided into 4 10-week seasons. So I have 40 pieces of content that I have to create. And I have 9 of them done. The question is, should I work over the Christmas break just for the arbitrary goal of having all 10 episodes shot? And the answer is, I'll be dead. I won't survive.
So tired. That sounds like a no.
Yes and no. But
it sounds like you need a nap.
Nap? I need a 3-week vacation. But that's not going to happen.
Well, if you could get all that 3 weeks of vacation in before Christmas in the next 10 days, that would be ideal.
Not going to happen. We have 9 episodes in post-production right now. And who else is going to scream at the editor? No, I look like shit in that photo, or you can see my broken fingernail with my bad manicure. Somebody has to look out for my own interests or something. Kidding. It's not the way it works. My editor.
All right, well, go have fun with your editor.
Thank you.
I guess maybe we'll No, I'm just kidding. We're not going to discuss the content of the next episode until we are filming it.
The next Carmudgeon episode?
Yeah.
Jesus Christ, we didn't discuss the content of this one until 3 minutes before we started taping.
I mean, after we started.
Actually, 3 minutes after we started taping. Yeah, I mean, I guess the big question is, will we manage to do another Carmudgeon before Christmas or before the end of the year? Or will the next one have to wait until 2021? Dun, dun, dun. I wish I knew the answer to that question.
Yeah, it beats the hell out of me. I don't know why you're posing this question.
Maybe the next episode, you'll be in a different kitchen. I think this should just be like, Derek Tam Scott travels around the world from kitchen to kitchen.
Yes. Maybe my brother's kitchen. We'll aim for my brother's kitchen.
There you go. And the only thing that stays the same is the pot upon which your laptop sits.
Yes, I'll take my traveling pot. It's not
All right,
what it sounds like, kids.
Well, it's legal now.
Don't do drugs. Oh, right.
Right, exactly.
Do only drugs.
Do only the drugs that are legal.
All right.
All right, well, tune in for the next Carmudgeon episode coming soon at an unknown time to a Carmudgeon station near you.